Novthamolobe wasn't addressed to me. That was the first thing I noticed when the estate attorney slid it across the conference table. My name wasn't on it. My mother's name was, except my mother had been dead for 11 years and the return address was a law firm in Portland I'd never heard of. Miss Calloway, the attorney said, then caught himself. I'd noticed he kept almost using that name, the one I'd gone back to after the divorce. Ms. Hewitt, before we proceed with your father's estate, there's a matter that requires your attention first. I remember the fluorescent light buzzing above us. I remember the leather chair being too cold. I remember thinking my father had just been buried 4 days ago and I hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night since the phone call. And now this man in his careful gray suit was looking at me the way people look at you when they're about to say something they rehearsed. Your father left 2 separate arrangements, he said. One for the estate you're aware of, and one that was established 8 years ago, held in trust, with a different beneficiary. I asked him to repeat that. He did. The second trust had been funded quietly, consistently for 8 years. Monthly transfers. A property in Bend, Oregon. A college savings account. The beneficiary was a child. A boy. 14 years old. I was 31. My father had been gone 72 hours, and I was sitting there learning I had a brother I never knew existed. I drove home the long way. I took the back roads along the river because I couldn't face the interstate, couldn't face merging and signaling and being a functional person. The sky over the Willamette Valley was the particular gray of February that isn't dramatic, just relentless, and I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't turn on the radio. My phone sat face down on the passenger seat. My sister had texted 3 times. I couldn't answer her yet. My father was a man people described as steady. That was the word everyone used at the service. Steady. A civil engineer who built bridges for 30 years, literally, the kind of person whose professional metaphors were embarrassingly on the nose. He coached Little League until I was 12. He made the same pot of coffee every morning, same amount of grounds, same mug with the faded Oregon State logo. He called me every Sunday at 7 p.m., never forgot, never canceled. When my marriage fell apart 3 years ago, he drove 6 hours to help me move boxes without once saying I told you so, even though he'd had reservations he'd kept entirely to himself. That was who he was to me. Or who I thought he was. There's a particular grief that happens when you lose someone and then lose them again a second time, differently. The first loss is clean, terrible, and yours. The second one is something else. It rewrites the first one. It makes you go back through everything and wonder what was real. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a long time. My neighbor was walking her dog and she waved. I waved back. She didn't know. No one knew yet. Inside, I changed into the oldest sweatshirt I owned, the one from my undergrad years that had a small bleach stain on the left sleeve, and I made tea I didn't drink, and I stood in my kitchen holding the business card the attorney had given me. The other beneficiary's guardian, the boy's mother, had been notified separately. They were prepared to meet if I wanted. No pressure, the attorney had said. Take your time. I put the card down on the counter next to my father's reading glasses, which I'd brought home from his house without knowing why, and I looked at them together for a long moment. Sunday dinner had been at his house every week for as long as I could remember, the same tablecloth, the same Dutch oven. Last month he'd asked me to help him label his spice jars because his handwriting was getting harder to read, and I'd done it and complained mildly about his organizational system, and he laughed, and that was the last completely ordinary day I could point to. I called my sister that night. She's 5 years older than me and lives in Boise and takes after her father in the way she goes quiet when things are serious, the way she pauses before she speaks to make sure she means it. When I told her, she didn't say anything for a long time. How certain is the attorney? She finally asked. Very, I said. Another pause. Okay, she said. Okay. Then, do you want me to come? I said yes. She was there by noon the next day. We sat at my kitchen table with the documents spread between us, and my sister read everything twice the way she always does, And then she set the papers down and looked at me and said, "He was sending money while we were at college, while Mom was sick." I hadn't let myself get that far yet. I got there now. Our mother's illness had lasted 4 years. Our father had been present for all of it, the kind of present that doesn't announce itself, just shows up. He managed her medications and her appointments and still went to work and still called us every Sunday and never once suggested to either of us that anything was wrong beyond what we could see. Our mother died in March, 11 years ago. Our father grieved in the steady way he did everything. He took up running. He started volunteering at the library on Thursdays. The first transfer to the trust in Portland had been made 7 months after her funeral. My sister put her hand over mine on the table. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that fit. I want to tell you I handled the next few days with grace. I didn't. I went through his house in a way that felt more like a search than a sorting, opening drawers that had always been closed, finding an old shoebox in the back of the hall closet that held nothing relevant, just birthday cards we'd made him as children, and a photo of him and my mother from before we were born, young and laughing on a beach I didn't recognize. I stood there holding that photo for a while. There was nothing in his house that explained anything. No letters, no second phone, no evidence of a whole other life because, and this was the part I kept coming back to, maybe it hadn't been a whole other life. Maybe it had been one moment, one decision, and then a quiet responsibility carried alone for 8 years. I didn't know. That was the problem. He wasn't here to ask. The boy's name was Owen. I learned this from the attorney when I called back. He was 14, a freshman in high school, lived with his mother in Portland. His mother had been a structural engineer who'd worked with my father on a project in 2010. It was brief. She hadn't told him she was pregnant until after, and by then she had decided to raise Owen on her own. My father had disagreed with that arrangement but ultimately respected it. He contributed financially. They had agreed on no contact with our family. "He asked about you," the attorney said. "Your father. Toward the end, he asked whether Owen should know." "Did Owen know about us?" I asked. He knew he had a father who cared about him from a distance. He didn't know specifics. I sat with that for a long time. My sister drove me to Portland 2 weeks later. I'd called ahead, spoken briefly with Owen's mother, a woman named Diana who had a careful voice and chose her words like she meant each one. She wasn't defensive. She didn't apologize. She said, "I understand this has been a shock. I want to be honest with you about what I know, if that's helpful." It was, actually. We met at a coffee shop near their neighborhood. Neutral ground, Diana's suggestion. She arrived first with Owen, who was tall in the sudden, awkward way of teenage boys, with my father's nose and my father's habit of looking at the floor when he was processing something difficult. I recognized that immediately and it hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. We shook hands. We sat down. The coffee shop was busy enough that the ambient noise helped, gave everyone somewhere to look besides directly at each other. Diana was straightforward. She told me she had informed Owen about our family when he was 12 in age-appropriate terms, and that he had taken it seriously and asked few questions and then gone back to his homework, which she said with a faint, exhausted smile I recognized as a mother's. She told me my father had sent letters to Owen through the attorney and letters Owen could open when he was older. She told me my father had not been in Owen's life in any day-to-day sense, but that Owen knew someone was watching from a distance, and that for a long time that had been enough. Was it enough? I asked. I wasn't sure who I was asking. Owen looked up from the table. He had my father's eyes, too. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think I'm still figuring that out." I understood that completely. We stayed for 2 hours. Owen asked about my father. The real questions, the specific ones. What did he eat for breakfast? Did he have a favorite team? Did he laugh a lot? I answered everyone honestly, including the complicated ones, including the one where I said I was still angry and still sad and still trying to understand, and that understanding might take a while. And I thought that was fair to say to a 14-year-old because he deserved honesty more than he deserved a tidy narrative. He nodded. My mom says you don't get to pick the story you're born into, he said. Just what you do with it. Diana looked at her coffee. I looked at my sister. My sister looked at me with an expression that meant she was not going to cry in this coffee shop, but it was a near thing. The drive home was quieter than the drive up. Somewhere past Salem, my sister said, he should have told us. Yes, I said. It doesn't change who he was to us. No, I said. It doesn't change who he was to us. No, I said. But it changes what I know about who he was. She nodded. That was the whole of it, really. Not a betrayal in the sharp, sudden sense. Something slower. A withholding. A decision made once and then maintained with the same steady discipline he applied to everything, and never revisited, or if revisited, never revised. I could build a version of my father where that made sense, where he was a man who made one mistake and then tried to manage its consequences responsibly without blowing up two families. I could build that version and it would have some truth to it, but I could also build the version where my mother spent her last years not knowing. Where the man who held her hand in the hospital was also carrying a secret she never had the chance to respond to. I didn't know which version was more complete. Maybe both were. I went back to work the following Monday. I'm an architect. I design residential spaces, mostly, and there's something stabilizing about spending your days thinking about structure and function and the way a room can be arranged to let light in. That week, I worked on a small house renovation in Eugene, a young couple, their first home, lots of questions about open floor plans and whether the kitchen island should have seating. It was exactly the right kind of work for where I was, specific, solvable, bounded. My father's estate took 4 months to settle. He'd been organized about it, which surprised no one. Clear documentation, clear instructions. He'd left a separate letter for my sister and me, written about a year before he died, which I read once and then put away in the shoebox with the birthday cards. He didn't explain in the letter so much as he apologized. He said he had made choices early that he later couldn't undo without causing pain, and that he'd told himself for a long time that causing no additional pain was the same as doing the right thing, and that he had eventually understood it wasn't. But by then, this was the part I read 3 times. By then he was afraid we wouldn't forgive him. He had been afraid of us. My father, who built bridges for 30 years, who never missed a Sunday call, who drove 6 hours to help me move boxes, had been afraid to tell us the truth because he thought we might not forgive him. I folded the letter and put it back and sat with that for a while. I called Diana in April. Not for any particular reason I'd planned, but Owen had a school project and had some questions about architecture. Diana had mentioned it casually at the coffee shop, and I'd said to reach out, and then for weeks I'd wondered if that had been the right thing to say. When she called, I was glad. Owen asked careful, earnest questions about load-bearing walls and the history of the bungalow style, and I answered them and sent him 2 books I'd had since graduate school with sticky notes marking the sections I thought he'd like. He sent back a thank you that was more thoughtful than most adult emails I receive. Diana texted the next day, "He's been carrying one of those books around for 4 days." I told my sister. She said, "So we have a little brother who likes architecture." "Half-brother," I said. "Sure," she said, in a tone that meant she was not particularly invested in the modifier. Owen came to visit in June with Diana, a weekend trip. We showed him around my studio. We went to Powell's Books, which he'd wanted to see, and he spent 40 minutes in the architecture section and came out with 3 books and a contented expression that reminded me so precisely of my father, that look he got when he found exactly the thing he wanted, that I had to look away for a moment. That evening, my sister made dinner, the same recipes my mother had used, pot roast and garlic bread, and the particular salad with the lemon dressing. It wasn't planned as a gesture. She just cooked what she cooked. But Owen ate 2 plates and asked what was in the dressing and wrote the recipe in the Notes app on his phone. And I watched him do that and thought about all the Sunday dinners he hadn't been at. And then I thought about all the Sunday dinners ahead that he could be. Neither thing undoes the other. That's what I've come to understand. My father's choices created a harm that can't be retroactively cleaned up. Owen grew up without knowing his father. My mother never knew. My sister and I carried a grief that, it turns out, was also carrying something we didn't know about. Those things are real, and they cost something. And this boy was sitting at my table writing down a salad dressing recipe. Both things are true. Both things are always going to be true. I'm not sure anymore that reconciling them is the point. Maybe the point is just to hold both and keep moving, which is perhaps what my father was trying to do, badly, quietly, alone. I got the letter from his estate attorney in September, the last piece of official correspondence. Everything settled, accounts closed, final documents filed. I signed the last form and sent it back, and then sat at my drafting table for a long time without drawing anything. I thought about the reading glasses still on my kitchen counter, which I hadn't moved. I thought about the photo of my parents on the beach, young and laughing. I thought about Owen asking what my father liked for breakfast. Oatmeal, I'd told him, with a specific brand of brown sugar he ordered on mine and considered non-negotiable, and the way Owen had laughed at that, surprised. Like he'd been given a small gift. I moved the reading glasses to my desk drawer, next to the shoebox. Not put away exactly, just placed where they'd be safe. My sister called that night like she does. She asked how I was doing, and I said I was doing, which is the accurate answer, and she said that's enough, and I think she was right. We talked about Thanksgiving, who was hosting, whether Owen and Diana might come. It felt both careful and ordinary, the way new things sometimes do when you're trying to hold them without squeezing too tight. I'm still working on the Eugene house. The couple has decided on seating at the island and a window above the sink that looks out toward the garden, and I've been thinking about how the morning light will move through that window, how it will change with the seasons, how in 10 years they'll stand at that sink and the light will fall the same way it does now, and they won't even notice because it'll just be home. That's the thing about structure, done right. It holds things, it lets life happen inside it. It isn't the life itself, just the shape that makes the life possible. I'm still figuring out what shape I'm building now. I think that's okay. I think I have time. Owen texted last week with a question about cantilever beams for a school project. I answered, and we went back and forth for 20 minutes, and at the end he sent a thumbs up, and then, after a pause, a second message, "Thanks for not making this weird." I typed back, "Give me time." He sent 3 laughing emojis. It was the most uncomplicated thing that had happened to me in months. I put down my phone and looked out the window at the February gray settling back in. The same color it had been the day the attorney slid that envelope across the table, and I thought about how much had changed inside the same weather, inside the same sky, and how the light was going to come back regardless, the way it always does. Quiet and unhurried and not particularly interested in whether you're ready. I'm learning to be ready anyway. If this story found you somewhere complicated, somewhere between grief and anger and a love you don't have a clean category for, you're not alone in that place. Some truths don't resolve. They just become something you carry better over time. If you've been through something like this, I'd want to hear about it. Leave it in the comments. Someone else down there probably needs to know they're not the only one. I've thought a lot about what my father was afraid of. Not the practical fears, not the ones that show up in paperwork or medical records. The quiet one. The one that made him carry a secret for 8 years instead of saying 3 sentences out loud. He was afraid we wouldn't forgive him. That's the part I keep returning to, even now. This man who built literal bridges for a living, who called every Sunday without fail, who showed up with a moving truck when my marriage ended and never said a word about it. He looked at the 2 daughters he'd raised and decided they might not be able to hold the truth about him. He made that calculation alone, in silence, and then he lived with it until he didn't have a choice anymore. I'm not angry at him the way I thought I'd be. I was, for a while. Those first few weeks were bad in a specific way that's hard to describe. Not grief exactly. More like trying to walk in a room where someone moved all the furniture in the dark. You know the space, you just can't trust it anymore. But here's what I've come to understand. The choices we hide don't disappear. They just grow in different directions, underground, until eventually the roots show up somewhere inconvenient, in an attorney's office, in a folder marked with a child's name. In the face of a 14-year-old boy who has your father's nose and his habit of looking at the floor when he's thinking hard. What my father withheld didn't protect anyone. It just delayed the weight from landing, and weight doesn't stop being heavy because you've postponed it. Owen didn't ask to carry any of this. He grew up with a father-shaped absence and filled it in with whatever he could. Letters he couldn't open yet, a trust account, the knowledge that someone somewhere thought he was worth providing for. That's not nothing. But it's not enough either, and my father knew that, I think. His letter said as much. He'd told himself that minimizing additional pain was the responsible thing to do. And then somewhere in the last years of his life he understood that reasoning had been more about his own comfort than anyone else's. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't get easier to practice the longer you wait. It gets harder. Every year you carry a withheld truth, it becomes more entangled with everything else, more expensive to surface, more frightening to say out loud. My father was a disciplined man who applied that discipline to staying silent, and the cost of that discipline fell on other people. I'm not saying I would have done better in his position. I genuinely don't know. I was 31 when I learned about Owen, and even knowing, even with all the shock and the grief and the rearranged furniture, even with all of that, I had a choice about what to do next. I could have walked away from that coffee shop and let the attorneys handle everything at arm's length and never seen Owen again. That would have been the easier path, at least in the short term. But easier and right aren't the same thing, and I learned that distinction from my father, which is one of the more complicated gifts he left me. Owen texted me last week about cantilever beams. My sister is already arguing about who hosts Thanksgiving. Diana makes careful, honest choices in a hard situation, and I respect her more than I've said out loud. None of this is tidy. It's just real. And real is what we have to work with. If you've ever stood at the edge of a truth that felt too costly to tell, I understand the hesitation. I do. But I also know now what it costs to keep it. The people you love are more capable of forgiveness than you think. And even if they aren't, they deserve the chance to try.